Shabbat Shalom. Though it may feel like a lifetime ago, this week began with January 20th, which was the observance of Martin Luther King Day and also Inauguration Day. That was a strange juxtaposition, to be sure, with King's life's work of building beloved communities standing alongside the professed values of the Trump administration. Perhaps the word dissonance applies, but the overlay of the two is productive in terms of our necessary reflection as citizens concerning how we want to be with each other. Dr. Susanna Heschel, preeminent scholar of Jewish studies and the daughter of icon of religious thought and social activism, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, writes the following words about her father's dear friend, Dr. King, supporting her belief and her father's that King embodied the presence of a modern-day prophet. And she writes, quote, "The prophet reminds his listeners of their moral obligation to respond, not simply to the prophet himself, but to those who suffer as a consequence of our immoral society. In this sense, King's beloved community is a moral invitation to choose citizenship in an alternative community of nonviolence, seeking to overcome what King identified as the three evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. A moral invitation to choose citizenship and nonviolence, a reminder of a moral obligation to everyone listening that they have a responsibility to heal the ills of their own society wherever they are." What a big and challenging idea this is. It's so big, the idea that we are issuing to one another, a prophet is issuing to us, God is issuing to a prophet a moral invitation. It's such a big idea that it feels almost impossible, unreachable, a fantasy rather than a strategy for societal change. Dr. Heschel's suggestion is that Dr. King, as prophet, had a message for all of us, issued an invitation to everyone. And that message, that invitation is, as all great prophecy, it is timeless in its divine wisdom and relevance, made all the more sacred by how very difficult it was to speak it into being in the first place. A case in point is found in our Parsha this week, Vayera, that Mo will render so beautifully tomorrow morning. The narrative begins amidst a conversation between God and Moses struggling to answer God's call to prophecy. The moral invitation is first presented to Moses as a prophet, and it is Moses' job to then share it with the Israelites and with Pharaoh. And to do this, Moses must first accept that invitation himself, view himself as worthy of receiving it, capable of doing it. And of course, as we know, he fears that he cannot. He does not believe that he will have the right words. And his belief is supported by the people's initial abandonment of him after the first challenge. Vaydaber Moshe Cain el bnei Yisrael v'lo sham'u el Moshe mikotzer ruach me'avodah kasha. Moses spoke as God had told him to the Israelites, but they did not listen to Moses because of their beleaguered, anguished spirit and the hard labor. And Moses returns to God and says, "Vaydaber Moshe lifnei Adonai lemur, hen b'nei Yisrael lo sham'u alai elai, ve'ech yashmi'eni paro, va'ani aral sfatayim." Moses spoke before God and said, "The Israelites didn't listen to me. The Israelites didn't listen to me. So how then is Pharaoh to listen to me with I such a slow tongue?" With these words, Moses is expressing recognizable self-doubt, a loss of faith in the very efficacy of language at all to express that moral invitation. He is expressing in the words of the Zohar, the central book of Jewish mysticism, dibur begalut, words in exile, the true obstacle in the path to the redemption of the world. Moses is looking at his world, the pain and the injustice in it, the fragile hope of the Israelites and the brutality of the Egyptian regime, and feeling that language itself is in exile. True communication enslaved, just like the people, transformational encounter inaccessible. In short, he feels this prophecy he's charged with to be out of reach. The Midrash describes this feeling in Moses using the vivid metaphor of a stalled birth, a baby that refuses to leave the womb, a new reality brought about by prophetic words of moral invitation. This new reality cannot be born unless the prophet finds the words to speak it into being. And so Moses, in the words he utters before God, if even the Israelites won't listen to me, how then will Pharaoh listen to me, is expressing the agony of his labor pains. Moses' sense that true connection between himself and Pharaoh, the Egyptians, and the Israelites is elusive. That feeling that he has, that sense that he has, is familiar, I suspect, to many of us, even today, as we walk through this time of polarization and bewilderment with one another, that our neighbors and our family members and dear friends could look at the world so differently from us. How do we break through, we ask ourselves all day long? How do we redeem, dibur b'galut, redeem our speech to one another from exile? How do we give birth to a new societal language that all of us, or at least more of us, can hear and understand? Amidst the dissonance of the inauguration festivities and MLK Day, I believe we received a worthy example of how this is done. On January 21st, the Right Reverend Mary Ann Buddy, the first female Episcopal Bishop of Washington, gave a sermon in the National Cathedral during the inauguration prayer service. Likely many of us have seen the recording of her words as she graciously and courageously spoke directly to our new president. And here is what she said and all she said. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people of our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some of whom fear for their lives. The people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meatpacking plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques and synagogues and gurudaras and temples. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were all strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people in this nation and the world. And she closes, Amen. This is what it sounds like when someone summons the courage to break through the exile of words, speaking in a way that others might be able to hear, even when it's hard. To be able to issue a moral invitation to the powerful of one's society to midwife into being a new reality requires us to let ourselves be birthed anew as well. To be called into a story of redemption, we must be willing to leave the womb of the exile of words. To be brave and tenacious enough to find the words that might enter another person's heart. According to this parashah, it is common for most prophets to suppress their prophecy, to hold feelings and stories in silence because they are afraid they cannot do it. Even Moses in our parsha struggles not to be born to his purpose in the very passage we read tomorrow. Ultimately, though, Moses concedes that he will step into this role and challenge the exile of language he feels and that he knows is all around him. And it is that decision, Reverend Buddy's decision, the decision to try, that is the dawn of our redemption. As we study the prophets of old and even the prophets of our own times, let us remember their struggles with this kind of language, their courage to step into the void and believe they will be able to find the right words, They do not always succeed, and the world they are trying to birth doesn't always come alive in their lifetime. Did Reverend Buddy change our society overnight? No, she did not. But she clearly understood that to be standing in that place at that time with that platform behind that microphone, she understood God to be coaxing her toward the role of speaking a prophecy, and she found within her the strength to step into it. Even as Moses finds the courage to speak, he is not able to turn Pharaoh's heart. He fails, and his words fall upon deaf ears. But his language does initiate a labor toward a new reality, and his words have inspired and given hope to hundreds of generations of midwives of a brighter future. To this very day, it is Moses' words we remember. Although Pharaoh did not hear them, the Israelites heard them, and the Egyptians heard them, and we, all these years later, we hear them as well. This is the truth I would want to say to the Right Reverend and to each of us. When we break through the exile of words and speak with integrity and compassion, which she did, a new world is on its way, even when the pharaohs of the world reject it. They are not the only audience for the words of a prophet. It says at the beginning of this parashah that the people could not hear Moses at first because they were kotzer ruach. They were of anguished spirit. We feel like that often now, and we will continue to feel like that sometimes in the future. But may words of those allowing themselves to be born into the words of moral invitation inspire a courage in us as well. May these examples of Moses, of Dr. King, of Rabbi Heschel, of the Right Reverend, and so many others replenish our ruach. May their words replenish our spirit, and may they coax us, each of us, toward the birth moments and the redemption of language and connection that we are all being called toward in this time. Shabbat Shalom.